blood and power. The twin obsessions that forged the reign of Henry VIII. As his colossal body decayed from within during the final, frozen days of 1547, England's most infamous king confronted his own mortality with the same cold calculation that had dispatched 2 wives and countless enemies to their graves. "The lion is dying," courtiers whispered behind locked doors, but his claws remained sharp until the very end. The journey to this grotesque finale began decades earlier with a handsome, athletic prince celebrated across Europe for his vigor and charm. How did this golden boy of the Renaissance devolve into the monstrous tyrant gasping for life in the shadowed chambers of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not merely in his infamous marriages, but in a devastating series of medical catastrophes that would twist both his body and his mind beyond all recognition. By January 1547, Henry was a phantom of the man who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body had become a ruin of afflictions, his legs riddled with suppurating ulcers that emitted an odor so foul that courtiers fought the urge to vomit in his presence. The king now depended on mechanical devices to move his enormous bulk, which some accounts claim had swelled to nearly 400 pounds. His once handsome face had grown distorted and bloated, the eyes sunken deep into flesh that bore a sickly, jaundiced hue. The royal physicians had exhausted their meager arsenal of remedies. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and desperate prayers all proved futile against the cocktail of ailments consuming their sovereign. Most modern historians concur that Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a searing bone infection that would explain the chronic agony in his legs. More terrifying was the king's mental disintegration. His legendary temper had devolved into explosive fits of rage, interspersed with periods of confused, heavy lethargy. Yet even as death clawed at him, the politics of succession consumed the royal court. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally granted him a male heir, the frail, 9-year-old Edward. But powerful factions were already maneuvering to seize control of the boy after Henry's demise. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, vied against the reformist Protestants under Edward Seymour, the young prince's own uncle. Henry, paranoid to the last, was acutely aware of these machinations, signing execution orders even as his hand struggled to hold a pen. The king's rapidly failing health remained one of the most jealously guarded secrets in the realm. Royal proclamations continued to paint Henry as hale and hearty, while reality whispered a far different story. Those admitted into the royal sickroom face a macabre spectacle: the immense royal bed shrouded in dark fabrics, the sickly sweet scent of decay barely masked by burning incense, and at its heart, the mountainous form of a man who had once symbolized the very vigor of England. Palace workers spoke in hushed tones of hearing the king's screams echoing through the stone corridors of Whitehall. Henry's leg ulcers inflicted such excruciating pain that even the slightest movement could trigger paroxysms of agony. His physicians applied poultices containing everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate remedies that only deepened his torment. More effective was the liberal use of opium, which dulled the king's pain but further clouded his already fractured mind. The psychological torment mirrored the physical. Henry had once been the most feared man in England, his word the literal arbiter of life or death. Now, he was utterly helpless against the betrayal of his own flesh. Court records show increasingly erratic behavior. Moments of near delirium where he would ramble about the ghosts of executed rivals or cry out for wives long dead. In his more lucid periods, the king obsessively reviewed his will, grimly determined to command the future of his dynasty from beyond the grave. Contemporaries noted with dread how the king oscillated between religious extremes during these final days. Having shattered the authority of Rome to establish himself as head of the Church of England, Henry now seemed tormented by spiritual uncertainty. He would demand Catholic rights one day, then fiercely reaffirm Protestant principles the next. His personal chaplain wrote how the king would awaken in terror from nightmares, claiming to have seen the faces of Thomas More and Bullen, and other victims of his tyranny standing in silent judgment at the foot of his bed. The king's impending death created a perilous power vacuum that his courtiers scrambled to fill. The Privy Council shattered into competing factions, each maneuvering to secure advantage in the coming regency. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, who had survived decades of lethal court intrigue, now found himself outmaneuvered by the ascendant Protestant faction. In a final chilling display of Henry's enduring ruthlessness, Norfolk was condemned to death for treason in the dying king's name, though he would narrowly survive when Henry expired just before the execution could be performed. January 27, 1547, marked the onset of Henry's final collapse. Witnesses reported a seizure so violent that attendants had to physically restrain him to prevent injury. When the episode subsided, Henry struggled to speak, his right side partially paralyzed. Stark evidence of what modern medicine identifies as a massive stroke. The court physicians, knowing that failing to save the king could mean their own disgrace or execution, worked frantically to revive their patient, applying hot irons to his skin and forcing bitter medicinal draughts down his throat. Throughout this ordeal, access to the royal bedchamber was ruthlessly controlled by Henry's most trusted advisor, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This secrecy served a purpose beyond mere dignity. News of the king's imminent death could trigger a premature grab for power or even foreign invasion. Cranmer ensured that only the most essential attendants were permitted entry, each sworn to absolute silence on the monarch's condition. Even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, was kept at a distance during the most critical periods. The king drifted in and out of consciousness. During brief moments of clarity, Henry reportedly voiced a growing terror of his imminent judgment before God. The man who had executed 2 wives, countless nobles, and thousands of common subjects now faced his own end with a creeping, undeniable dread. According to one attendant's diary, the king was heard muttering prayers and begging for forgiveness in his sleep, a shocking contrast to the unyielding autocrat who had reshaped England's faith through sheer force of will. Court records reveal the extraordinary measures taken to preserve Henry's last shreds of dignity. As his bodily functions failed, teams of servants worked in shifts to manage the grim tasks of cleaning and moving the massive royal body. The ulcers on his legs had become so severe that bone was reportedly visible through necrotic tissue. The stench grew so overwhelming that perfumed handkerchiefs became essential for anyone entering the royal chamber, and windows were flung open to the winter cold whenever the king lost consciousness. By January 27th, even the elaborate pretense of recovery could no longer be sustained within court circles. Archbishop Cranmer was summoned urgently to the royal bedside as Henry's breathing grew ragged and shallow. Contemporary accounts describe how the king, unable to speak, was asked to squeeze Cranmer's hand if he placed his faith in Christ. Henry reportedly squeezed with his remaining strength before slipping into his final coma, a poignant detail often cited by Protestant historians as proof of a deathbed conversion. The king died before the dawn of January 28, 1547. Even in death, Henry's enormous physical presence dominated the royal chamber, his corpse a grotesque monument to a life of excess and pain. The official cause was recorded simply as natural decay, though modern analysis suggests a lethal cocktail of heart failure, sepsis from his infected wounds, and complications from probable type 2 diabetes. More remarkable than the death itself was the extraordinary conspiracy of silence that ensued, as the Privy Council suppressed the news for 3 full days while consolidating power around the young Edward VI. This delay proved crucial. While Henry's body lay cooling, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford and uncle to the new king, moved with ruthless efficiency to secure control. Secret meetings were held, key fortresses secured, and potential rivals neutralized before the public announcement of Henry's death on January 31st. When the bells of London finally tolled for the departed monarch, Edward Seymour had already been named Lord Protector and Duke of Somerset, effectively ruling England in his nephew's stead. The disposal of Henry's remains posed unique challenges. Court records document that the royal corpse began decomposing with alarming speed, a likely result of the advanced infections already raging within him. Embalmers worked frantically, removing internal organs and filling the cavities with fragrant herbs. Even these experts were reportedly shocked by the state of Henry's organs, particularly his diseased liver and engorged heart. Henry's coffin required special construction for his enormous girth, reportedly measuring nearly twice the width of a standard casket. Its weight demanded a reinforced bier and extra pallbearers. During the lying in state, witnesses reported that the lead-lined coffin actually split under the pressure of gases building within the decomposing body, leaking fluids onto the chapel floor. This macabre detail was hastily concealed, but accounts suggest that dogs licked at the seepage, a grotesque final indignity for a king obsessed with his own majesty. The funeral procession to Windsor on February 16th was the Tudor regime's final chance to display Henry's power. Black-draped horses pulled the massive coffin through streets lined with mourners, while effigies depicted the king in his prime, not the bloated figure he had become. At St. George's Chapel in Windsor, Henry was laid to rest beside Jane Seymour, the only wife who gave him a son, and the only one spared his changing affections by an early death. The physical reality of Henry's decaying corpse stood in stark contrast to the myth-making already underway. Court painters like Hans Holbein had crafted the enduring image of Henry as the embodiment of masculine power, a defiant glare on his face. This propaganda bore little resemblance to the disease-ravaged body sealed beneath Windsor's floor, yet it would become the definitive image of Henry VIII for centuries. Henry's will revealed his final, desperate attempts to control the future. The 30-page document meticulously laid out the succession. First Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. This clear line, though briefly interrupted, would ultimately be followed exactly as he specified. The king's posthumous grip on England would extend through all three of his children before the dynasty ended with Elizabeth I's death in 1603. More immediately significant was the Regency Council of 16 men he created to govern collectively, a design reflecting his deep distrust of any single nobleman. However, his careful planning was swiftly undermined as Edward Seymour outmaneuvered his rivals to be named Lord Protector. The speed with which Henry's wishes were subverted demonstrated the stark limits of a king's power once death had silenced his fearsome presence. The medical legacy of Henry's final days continues to fascinate. His symptoms have been retrospectively diagnosed as everything from syphilis to scurvy, though the most compelling evidence points to type 2 diabetes complicated by chronic osteomyelitis. His medical records reveal increasingly desperate treatments, from the application of live pigeons cut in half to experimental concoctions of gold and pulverized gems. These costly yet futile remedies reveal the stark limitations of Tudor medicine, turning the king's final chapter into one of history's most harrowing tales of suffering. Perhaps most poignant were the personal effects discovered in the king's chambers. Among the expected trappings of power, jeweled daggers, official seals, servants found a small, locked chest containing more intimate items, a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a lock of hair from his mother, and a child's handwritten prayer book. These humanizing details offer a fleeting glimpse of the man behind the monster, suggesting that even as his body and mind crumbled, some connection to human sentiment remained. The king's death triggered immediate political realignments. Conservative Catholic forces were abruptly sidelined as Edward Seymour established a decisively Protestant regency. Archbishop Cranmer, who had administered last rites, now accelerated religious reforms that Henry had approached with caution, pushing England further toward Protestant doctrine than the king himself had ever intended. Henry's complex religious stance, breaking with Rome while retaining many Catholic practices, created an ambiguous legacy. Protestant reformers emphasized his rejection of papal authority, while Catholics pointed to his defense of core Catholic theology. This ambiguity would fuel the religious conflicts that defined the reigns of all three of his children, as England swung violently between religious extremes. The king's death also marked a crucial turning point in Tudor propaganda. Royal publicists now faced the challenge of transferring his immense authority to a 9-year-old boy. Portraits of young Edward VI deliberately echoed his father's iconic, wide-legged stance. Court ceremonies emphasized continuity, with courtiers required to bow to Edward's empty throne with the same reverence they had shown his father. Beyond the political sphere, Henry's death reverberated through daily life. For nearly 4 decades, he had been the embodiment of royal authority. His passing created a psychological vacuum as much as a political one. Parish records from early 1547 reveal widespread anxiety, with increased reports of prophetic dreams and strange omens. For a populace steeped in religious symbolism, the death of such a titan inevitably carried apocalyptic undertones. International reactions were mixed. The French ambassador reported that King Francis I genuinely mourned his dear brother, despite their repeated conflicts. Emperor Charles V more pragmatically assessed the strategic implications. Pope Paul III, who had excommunicated Henry, reportedly offered a mass for the king's soul, a diplomatic gesture acknowledging Henry's significance while reasserting the Catholic claim on his destiny. The physical space where Henry died, his private chambers in Whitehall, became charged with historical weight. Courtiers reported a reluctance to enter the rooms where the king had suffered his final agonies. Young Edward VI reportedly refused to sleep in his father's bed. This psychological aftermath reflects the traumatic impact of Henry's decline on those who had witnessed it firsthand. Henry's medical case remains one of history's most well-documented royal deaths, providing invaluable insights into Tudor practices. His physicians kept detailed records, preserved as evidence that everything possible had been done. These documents reveal an approach combining ancient Galenic medicine with emerging Renaissance techniques. The failure of these methods demonstrates the profound limitations faced by even the most advanced practitioners of the era. The king's obsession with his posthumous image extended to explicit instructions for his tomb, a monument so massive it would dwarf all others. He commissioned elaborate designs featuring 40 life-size bronze figures and a towering equestrian statue of himself. This grandiose plan reflected both his ego and his anxiety about his legacy. Ironically, the project remained unfinished, and the bronze figures were later melted down during the English Civil War, a fate that would have infuriated the image-obsessed king. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death saw a frantic rush to either secure or distance oneself from his legacy. Courtiers who had fallen from favor emerged from hiding, while others scrambled to forge new alliances. For many, adaptation proved impossible. The skills required to manage Henry's volcanic temperament had no application in the new court. Some former favorites, unable to navigate the new landscape, even took their own lives. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's death marked the beginning of a critical transition in English governance, from rule by an absolutist monarch to more collaborative forms of power. Edward Seymour, as Lord Protector, lacked Henry's terrifying personal authority and had to rely more on council approval. This shift, though temporarily reversed under Mary, established precedents for the constraint of royal power that would define England's future. Henry's death thus paradoxically weakened the very institution of absolute monarchy he had spent his life embodying. The king's final illness became a subject of intense medical retrospection. Victorian doctors, influenced by moral perspectives, emphasized syphilis as divine retribution for his excesses. Early 20th century specialists focused on metabolic disorders. Modern medical historians have proposed more complex diagnoses, including rare genetic conditions or even chronic traumatic encephalopathy resulting from jousting injuries. The disposal of Henry's personal possessions provides a revealing glimpse into Tudor attitudes toward death. Court inventories document how objects touched by the king in his final days were treated with a kind of reverence, some preserved as quasi-relics. His final set of night clothes, stained and soiled, was ceremonially burned under Cranmer's supervision, an act combining practical sanitation with potent symbolism. Henry's death placed his surviving wives and children in precarious positions. Catherine Parr, his widow, moved with remarkable speed to marry her true love, Thomas Seymour. 9-year-old Edward, now king, recorded his father's death with a chilling detachment in his journal. "The king my father died." The formal, unemotional entry suggests the vast distance between father and son. Meanwhile, Henry's daughters faced their own trials. Mary, at 31, remained a devout Catholic, increasingly isolated by Edward's Protestant reforms. Elizabeth, just 13, had to navigate court life with extraordinary caution, her position forever vulnerable. Both princesses would eventually ascend to the throne Henry had promised them, but the path would prove perilous, marked by rebellion and imprisonment. The accounts of Henry's final hours reveal the profound isolation of even the most powerful monarch. Despite being surrounded by attendants, he faced his end in essential solitude, separated from others by his royal status and the uniquely personal nature of death itself. The king who had commanded absolute obedience found himself journeying into the great unknown alone, a stark reminder of mortality's great leveling power. The year following Henry's death revealed how thoroughly his personality had dominated English governance. Administrative records show a backlog of decisions that had awaited his personal whim. Under the Regency, government processes were necessarily restructured to function without the king's direct involvement. This transition, while initially chaotic, ultimately strengthened institutional governance, creating bureaucratic systems that could operate independently of the monarch. Henry's elaborate funeral procession represented his final appearance in England's public theatre of power. A life-sized wax effigy of the king in full regalia sat atop his coffin, the artificial body substituting for the decaying one concealed beneath. The procession traveled from London to Windsor over several days, allowing thousands of subjects to witness this last manifestation of Tudor majesty, a ritual designed to reinforce the message that while the king might die, the monarchy endured. Court physicians who had failed to save the king faced uncertain futures. Dr. Thomas Wendy, who had been brave enough to inform Henry of his approaching death when others dared not, parlayed this courage into continued royal service. The king's apothecaries faced particular scrutiny, their inventories examined for any hint of negligence or, worse, deliberate poison. The scientific examination of Henry's remains during vault renovations in the 1800s provided tantalizing physical evidence. Workers found an enormous skeleton consistent with his stature, showing severe joint deterioration. Forensic techniques applied to historical records suggest Henry may have weighed approximately 400 pounds, with a waist exceeding 50 inches. This extreme obesity, combined with poor circulation and open wounds, created ideal conditions for the sepsis that likely ended his life. Perhaps most revealing is what Henry's final days tell us about the absolute limits of power. The king who had reshaped a nation's faith, executed queens with impunity, and built a navy that would one day rule the oceans was utterly helpless against his own body's decay. Court records describe Henry raging at his physicians, demanding they restore his health by sheer force of royal command. This futile defiance against biological reality reveals the central paradox of his reign, the inescapable vulnerability of even the most powerful human body. The religious ambiguity surrounding Henry's death created space for competing narratives. Protestant chroniclers emphasized deathbed moments of evangelical clarity, while Catholic writers depicted a king tormented by regret. In reality, evidence suggests Henry maintained his unique religious position to the end. Supreme head of the English Church, yet a defender of Catholic ceremony. This complex stance reflected his lifelong tendency to reshape institutions around his personal will rather than conform to any external standard. The economic consequences of Henry's death were dire. The new regency inherited a depleted treasury and debased currency, the result of Henry's expensive wars and lavish spending. By some estimates, he spent the modern equivalent of £200 million on palaces alone. This crisis forced Edward Seymour to continue Henry's controversial policy of selling monastic lands, accelerating one of the largest transfers of property in English history and fueling the social unrest that would plague his children's reigns. Henry's physical decline served as a potent metaphor for his contemporaries. Just as medieval theory presented the monarch as the head of the body politic, Tudor writers saw Henry's decaying flesh as emblematic of a deeper corruption in the realm. Surviving sermons from 1547 draw explicit parallels between the king's infected legs and perceived moral rot in English society. This symbolic reading gained political force during Edward's reign, as reformers argued that England's religious body, like Henry's physical one, required radical purification. The final days of Henry VIII represent a unique collision of the medieval and early modern worlds. The elaborate death rituals and anxiety about succession reflected ancient patterns of kingship. Yet, the detailed medical records, the legal precision of his will, and the institutional continuity of government represented a more modern approach to state power. Henry thus died straddling two eras: the last English king to wield truly medieval authority, and the monarch who pioneered the bureaucratic state that would define the future. What ultimately makes Henry VIII's death so compelling is not just its gruesome detail or political gravity, but what it reveals about the human condition. The king who dominated his era through sheer force of will ended his life confronting the same limits faced by the humblest of his subjects. In his final days, Henry experienced moments of raw, existential terror, facing judgment not as a king, but as a man. As the archbishop reportedly reminded him, "You are about to appear where no titles bear weight and no earthly power offers protection." In that final, fragile vulnerability, perhaps England's most infamous king finally found the one connection with his subjects that had eluded him throughout his entire reign.